Imagine an empire at its zenith. Not an empire built merely on legions and steel, but on the silent, unshakable bedrock of trust. Trust embodied in a small, dull piece of metal. For centuries, this piece of metal, a coin, was the guarantee of civilization. It bought grain in Alexandria, paid soldiers on the Rhine, and funded the great aqueducts of Rome. Its value was intrinsic, immutable, a promise cast in silver. This stability was the engine of global commerce, the very definition of economic certainty. But certainty is a fragile thing, especially when weighed against the immediate demands of power. History rarely turns on dramatic battles alone. Often the pivotal shifts are subtle, administrative, almost boring. They happen in the quiet chambers of finance, where a desperate leader or an overstretched treasury official makes a choice that at the time feels entirely rational, entirely necessary, a technical adjustment to manage a temporary budget deficit. It is the choice to compromise the eternal for the ephemeral. We are trained to look for the clash of armies, the rhetoric of revolution, the fall of walls. Yet the most profound changes often begin with a simple instruction: reduce the silver content. This is the story of that instruction. It was not an act of malice, nor a grand conspiracy. It was an economic calculation rooted in the cold logic of necessity. The massive state, facing relentless military pressure on its vast frontiers, needed more money than its mines could provide. The solution was elegant in its simplicity: stretch the existing supply of precious metal further, mint more coins, but make each one slightly less valuable. A fraction of a percent here, a few grams there. Who would notice? In the short term, the strategy worked. The immediate crisis was averted. The troops were paid, the public works continued, and the illusion of solvency was maintained. The system breathed a sigh of relief. But the true cost of this decision was not counted in coins or ounces of silver. It was counted in the slow, agonizing erosion of institutional trust. This single, seemingly minor technical adjustment, the deliberate dilution of the core medium of exchange, did not just fund a war, it fundamentally rewrote the rules of economic engagement for an entire civilization. It was the introduction of a subtle poison into the bloodstream of the empire. It created a distortion, invisible at first, accumulating silently like snow in the mountains, destined eventually to trigger an avalanche. This documentary is an investigation into how the pursuit of short-term stability, the quick fix, can become the ultimate agent of long-term destruction. We will trace the path from a glittering silver coin in the 1st century, a symbol of imperial confidence, to the bronze-washed tokens of the 3rd century, symbols of desperation and chaotic inflation. We will explore the mechanism of debasement, not just as a financial tool, but as a corrosive force that altered social contracts, redefined power structures, and ultimately guaranteed the fragmentation of the Western world. We live today in a world grappling with the legacies of decisions made centuries ago. Do we truly understand the intrinsic value of the currency we hold, or are we repeating the ancient mistakes, prioritizing immediate relief over systemic health? The history of economic collapse is rarely a sudden crash. It is almost always a slow, deliberate surrender of quality for quantity. Prepare yourself, for we are about to unearth the mechanism of decay, the financial sleight of hand that provided temporary relief but led to permanent decline. This is the story of the economic mistake that changed history forever. The Roman Empire during the 1st century CE represented an unprecedented achievement in centralized organization. Its stability was rooted not in ideology, but in infrastructure and reliable administration. At the heart of this colossal machine was the denarius. Established centuries earlier, the silver denarius was the standard of the Mediterranean world. For nearly 200 years, under the early emperors, the purity of this coin remained remarkably consistent, typically around 95 to 98% pure silver. This metallic integrity was crucial. It meant that a farmer in Gaul, a merchant in Carthage, and a soldier stationed in Britannia all had absolute faith that the coin they held today would retain its purchasing power tomorrow. This trust facilitated long-distance trade, allowed for predictable taxation, and ensured the loyalty of the legions, who were often paid directly in silver. The denarius was more than currency. It was a physical manifestation of Rome's commitment to order, a circulating promise of imperial stability. But even the greatest empires are fundamentally economic enterprises, vulnerable to the simple arithmetic of income versus expenditure. The Pax Romana, while peaceful internally, required constant expensive vigilance on its vast borders, particularly along the Danube and the Rhine. Maintaining hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers, funding the monumental building projects that defined Roman power, and funding the great grain supply necessary to feed the capital, all of this placed an immense, continuous strain on the imperial treasury. The early emperors, such as Augustus and Tiberius, managed this delicate balance through careful fiscal policy and expansion that brought in new wealth. But as the empire matured, the easy conquests ceased and the expenses mounted. The temptation to find a shortcut, a way to print prosperity without mining new silver, began to loom large. If you find this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of history fascinating, consider subscribing to Timeline Unearthed. We strive to bring you these complex, consequential narratives every week. Your support helps us continue to unearth the stories that truly shaped our modern world. The stage was set, a system built on perfect metallic honesty, facing the political reality of increasing, unavoidable debt. The first leader to truly succumb to this pressure would initiate a chain reaction that no subsequent emperor could fully reverse. The economic mistake was known as debasing the coinage. It is a concept deceptively simple, yet historically ruinous. When the state mints a coin, the cost of the metal used is its intrinsic value. Any difference between the coin's face value and its intrinsic value is profit for the state, a form of tax known as seigniorage. As Rome's financial needs grew, the emperors sought to increase this profit margin. Instead of raising unpopular taxes or suffering crippling debt, they chose the path of stealth inflation. The method was straightforward. Take a fixed weight of silver, melt it down, and add a cheaper base metal, copper, tin, or bronze. Then mint the same number of coins, or even more, claiming they still held the original face value. For example, if a denarius was originally 95% silver, a desperate emperor might reduce it to 90%. The freed-up 5% of pure silver could then be used to mint new coins, effectively creating money out of thin air. This was a brilliant, if utterly dishonest, way to finance immediate obligations. It was a transfer of wealth, quietly executed, from the public to the state. The immediate effect was a surge of liquidity. The legions were paid, infrastructure projects continued, the treasury appeared robust. But the market, the collective wisdom of millions of transacting citizens, could not be fooled forever. People quickly realized that the new coins felt lighter, looked duller, and most importantly, bought less. The crucial dynamic emerged. The public began hoarding the old high-purity silver coins, the good money, and spending the new debased coins, the bad money. This behavioral shift accelerated the crisis. If you have two coins of equal face value but unequal metal content, which one do you use to pay your debts and which one do you keep hidden in your chest? The answer is obvious. The good money vanished from circulation, leaving only the increasingly devalued, debased currency to handle all transactions. This forced price increases, inflation, as merchants compensated for the declining intrinsic value of the payment they received. The first critical step down this path is often attributed to Nero in the mid-1st century CE, though the pressure was constant. Nero's administration lowered the silver content of the denarius significantly, primarily to fund lavish public works and personal expenditure. While historians often focus on his excesses, his financial innovation, or rather his financial compromise, set a dangerous precedent. For a period, the sheer economic weight and administrative capacity of the Roman Empire masked the severity of the mistake. The empire was so vast, its trade routes so established, its military so dominant, that the market simply had to accept the imperial currency. The state was the ultimate consumer and the ultimate supplier. The initial debasement was absorbed as a minor inconvenience, a slight economic friction. The system was designed to handle minor shocks. The centralized control over minting meant that while the coins were physically poorer, the legal mandate of the emperor forced their acceptance. This created an illusion of control. The rulers believed they had found a sustainable loophole, a way to continuously extract resources without overt taxation, funding an ever-expanding state without visible opposition. This era, spanning into the 2nd century, marked the peak of Roman expansion and apparent prosperity. The silver content might have dropped incrementally, but the roads were safe, the borders were largely quiet, and the tax collection machinery was efficient. This period of sustained stability, bought partly through diluted currency, ironically became the very mechanism that allowed the fatal flaw to become systemic. The true engine sustained by this debased currency was the military machine. The legions were the guarantee of the emperor's power, the enforcers of the Pax Romana, and the constant drain on the treasury. Paying the legions was the single most vital economic task of the state. By continuously debasing the denarius, the emperors ensured a continuous supply of cash flow necessary for military salaries, bonuses, and arms procurement. This mechanism was a political lifeline. It allowed emperors to avoid the civil unrest that often followed steep tax hikes or insufficient military pay. In essence, the debasement was a political premium paid by the entire populace to maintain the loyalty of the soldiers. However, the soldiers themselves were not oblivious to the deteriorating value of their wages. As the silver content plummeted, their purchasing power diminished. They were paid in bad money, but when they bought goods, especially luxury items or items imported from outside the imperial economy, merchants demanded compensation for the loss of value. This forced the emperors into a vicious cycle. To compensate for the reduced value of the coins, they had to increase the nominal salaries, but higher nominal salaries meant minting even more debased coins, further fueling inflation. The mechanism that sustained power was also the mechanism that guaranteed its eventual insolvency. It was a financial feedback loop, designed to keep the soldiers happy today, regardless of the systemic cost tomorrow. This was the subtle, corrosive genius of the economic mistake. It traded financial trust for immediate military obedience. The illusion of control shattered violently in the 3rd century CE. This period, often termed the crisis of the 3rd century, was characterized by constant civil war, plague, and intense barbarian pressure on every frontier. The empire, already weakened by systemic financial decay, was now subjected to external shocks it could no longer absorb. The demand for cash to raise new armies and pay for endless defenses became astronomical. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, the so-called barracks emperors, each one needing immediate funds to buy the loyalty of the troops that had just deposed his predecessor. This political instability accelerated the debasement to catastrophic levels.
Where Nero had reduced the silver content to 90%, by the reign of Gallienus, mid-3rd century, the denarius, or what passed for it, contained barely 5% silver, often less. It was essentially a bronze coin with a thin silver wash applied to make it look like currency. The intrinsic value had almost entirely been stripped away. This was the first visible fissure. The market completely rejected the state's claim of value. Prices spiraled into hyperinflation. Farmers refused to sell grain for worthless bronze tokens. Instead, they demanded payment in kind, in goods, in services, and in the remaining hoarded good silver coins. The monetary economy, the sophisticated system that had underpinned the Mediterranean world for centuries, began to break down into localized, inefficient barter systems. Rome was losing control not just of its borders, but of its internal economy. The invisible distortion had become a palpable crisis.
The crisis was more than just high prices. It was a crisis of faith in the state itself. When the currency is unreliable, the entire administrative structure, taxation, contracts, military supply, becomes dysfunctional. Tax collectors could no longer accurately gauge the real value of their receipts. Soldiers, paid in rapidly depreciating scrip, became restless, mutinous, and increasingly willing to support any general who promised a secure source of real wealth, usually plunder. Private citizens, unable to rely on the banking system or official coinage, reverted to hoarding gold and silver bullion, driving these precious metals further out of circulation. Capital investment halted. Why invest in a long-term enterprise when the returns would be paid in worthless currency? The rich, possessing land and real assets, weathered the storm by demanding rents in kind, foodstuffs, labor. The poor and the middle classes, those who relied on fixed wages or savings, were utterly devastated. This economic mistake, initially a technical fix, devolved into a profound engine of social stratification and inequality. We must ask ourselves, how often do we see today, in modern fiscal policy, the echoes of this ancient impatience, where the immediate political benefit outweighs the enduring structural integrity? The empire was fragmenting, not just geographically into breakaway states like the Gallic Empire or Palmyra, but economically. Different regions began to mint their own, often slightly better currency, further undermining the central authority in Rome. The economic mistake had transformed into a geopolitical catastrophe. The greatest legacy of this economic mistake is not the ruins it left behind, but the timeless instruction it provides. Vigilance is the highest form of fiscal responsibility. We are tasked not just with observing the mechanics of money, but with scrutinizing the moral character of its management. The true practice begins now, in our recognition that the health of our complex, interconnected global economy depends less on technological innovation and more on the ancient, fragile virtue of credibility. We must remain skeptical of any solution that offers immediate ease at the expense of systemic soundness. The weight of history confirms that the foundation of a durable civilization is built on the unshakable certainty of its economic promises. That certainty, once lost, can take 1,000 years to recover. The history of the denarius is not merely the story of a coin's decay. It is the definitive case study in how the failure of fiduciary duty can dismantle an entire civilization. It reminds us that every unit of exchange, regardless of its composition, carries within it a promise that must be defended against all political pressure. The failure to do so is the ultimate economic mistake, transcending time and technology. If these themes fascinate you, consider subscribing to accompany our next documentaries, where we continue to analyze the critical junctures where finance and history intersect. The true study of economics is the study of human nature under pressure,
And these are the stories that illuminate that crucial intersection.